Hello and welcome to the Shifting the Paradigm webinar series, where we build community knowledge, skills, confidence and understanding of child sexual exploitation. We hope that you find this webinar beneficial.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for having me on this webinar today. So I don't have slides for the webinar. I will just be talking to this particular issue, which is about the online manosphere and the violence, the role it plays in violence, particularly directed towards women. I wanted to start off by saying that I do not have specific data. I know that Project Paradigm is specifically focused around child abuse and violence towards children. I don't have specific data on child abuse related to the manosphere, but obviously there are strong links between the manosphere, violence and sexual violence directed towards women, and violence directed towards children. And I'm happy to have that conversation about some of those links at the end of the webinar. I would like to start by also acknowledging that I'm presenting on Ngunnawal country here in Canberra in the ACT, and pay respects to elders past and present, and welcome any Aboriginal people Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here who are participating in the webinar today. So thank you all for having me. What I want to do today is I'll give you a brief introduction to myself and my research interests. I'll talk about what the manosphere is, and then talk about the different types of violence that emanate from the manosphere, and go through the different ways that violence is displayed in the manosphere. I'll have a specific conversation about the role of social media in perpetuating this violence. And then I'm going to have some discussion about what's driving the violence, what's the underlying causes of these violent trends from manosphere men in particular. And then conclude by talking about how we can think about the community and some of the ways that we can address the violence that is coming from this community. I don't have slides. I like to just be able to chat. I'll run through these topics. I'll go for maybe about 40 minutes, and then we'll leave some time for questions at the end. So just a brief introduction to who I am. As I said, as Hayley said, I'm Dr. Simon Copland. I have been researching this topic and the far right and online extremism for almost 10 years now. I completed my PhD at the Australian National University in this topic, and just recently I published a book with Polity Press about the manosphere called The Male Complaint, The Manosphere and Online Misogyny. And that was released last year, and hopefully we're able to send around some links after the webinar is finished if you want to have a look at the book. I've been researching this topic with a broad interest in understanding significant changes that we're seeing in the world, in particular the rise of these kind of extremist and violent communities, and understanding what is driving people, in particular in this context, men, to participate in these communities, with a real thought about how we can then shift our practice, shift policy processes, shift policies themselves to address these communities and to really reduce the violence and extremism that is coming from these places. You might not all know what is meant by the manosphere, but you might have a sense of some of these players and some of the things that I'm talking about. So just to give a bit of context, you may have recently seen a lot of discussion online about looks maxing, which is a component of the manosphere, and that is men who do a lot of things to improve their looks through quite extreme behaviors quite frequently. And you may have heard of the very famous influencer Clavicula recently. There's a good chance you've heard of Andrew Tate, who is one of the most famous manosphere influencers, and is someone who's having real influence amongst a lot of young men. You may have heard of incels and a range of violent attacks that have been undertaken by incels. I'll talk about all of these, but I wanted to just give you a bit of context to understand where we're starting from. There's a range of, the reason I give this context is to understand that there's a range of growing concern and discussion about the manosphere. And a lot of men and influencers in particular are becoming extremely globally famous and having significant influence. And we're seeing a growing researchers are seeing, and I imagine practitioners are seeing a growing influence of a lot of these influencers, a lot of their ideas amongst young men, and we're seeing the connections between a lot of their ideas and patterns of abuse and violence, particularly that directed towards women. So let's get into it in a bit more detail. So what is the manosphere? So, according to their website, Know Your Meme, and I just realized that this is a quote that I took from over 10 years ago now. The manosphere is a neologism used to describe a loose network of blogs, forums, and online communities on the primarily English-speaking web that are devoted to a wide range of men's interests, from life philosophies and gender relations to self-improvement tips and strategies for success in life, relationships, and sex. Now, that definition always seems a little benign, but it is a really good starting point to understand what the manosphere is. But there is a deeper underlying ideology that exists within this community. So the manosphere consists of a range of different groups who believe primarily that feminism and women more broadly have destroyed not just their lives, but politics, the economy, and society. These groups all come together under this banner due to what Marwick and Copland describe as a belief that feminine values dominate society, that this fact is suppressed by feminists and political correctness, and that men must fight back against an overarching misandrist, and that means male-hating, culture to protect their very existence. As I've already noted, the Manosphere has spawned a series of high-profile celebrities, including the former kickboxer Andrew Tate, the psychologist Jordan Peterson, who you may have heard of, the right-wing shock jock Milo Yiannopoulos, who is nowhere near as famous anymore, the famed pickup artist Roosh V, as well as the looks maxer Clavicula, who's become just famous in the last 12 months. These men have profited heavily off the manosphere and manosphere adjacent ideas, often through speaking tours, social media income, and running a range of courses teaching men about how they can improve their lives. And that financial component is really core to the community. So who are these disparate but overlapping groups? There are really four groups, subgroups that exist within the manosphere. So first, there's men's rights activists, which is a movement that's been around since the 1970s, who argue that men are discriminated against in society, particularly around things like fathers' rights and child custody battles. There's pickup artists in the seduction industry who also fall under a title called the Red Pill, which teaches men manipulative techniques to pick up women. And they also do a whole lot of self-help for men, going to the gym, changing behaviors, these types of things, a lot of self-help driven community. There's incels who believe that due to a range of their own genetic traits that they are inherently ugly, effectively, and unable to obtain romantic or sexual relationships with women. And incels often become quite resentful of this, and there's been a number of violent attacks undertaken by incels. And then there's men going their own way, who are often, but not always, divorced men who are so angry at women that they decide to avoid sexual and romantic relationships entirely. These groups are disparate and they have disagreements, but they all have a generally consistent ideology. They all claim that there are inherent and genetically determined differences between men and women, particularly around relationships. They see men as inherently rational and logical, while women are irrational, emotional, and most of all are hardwired to pair with what manosphere men describe as alpha males. Meanwhile, they believe the society has always been gynocentric. That is a term that means that it's focused on the needs of women. They believe that women are revered while men engage in hard and dangerous work. In decades gone by, they claim society created a balance between these two genders by giving men purpose, by making them leaders in fields like politics and business. These inherent differences were respected and society was more harmonious. But Manosphere men believe that the feminism and recent social changes have not only reinforced this gynocentrism, but have taken away any social purpose or value men have. Feminism has removed a balance, upset the apple cart, giving women a dominant position. They've taken over men's roles and attacked men's inherent masculinity, leaving men out to sea. In doing so, these groups are aligned with far-right and fascist groups, particularly the ideas around the inherent differences between men and women, a lot of the violence that comes from the community, and there's also strong links between the manosphere and white supremacist ideals, which I won't go into in so much depth in this webinar. So, after a brief discussion about what the manosphere is, I want to talk about the violence that emanates from the manosphere, and I'll talk about really because I talk about this because I think it's relevant to you folks participating today, but also because the manosphere has become a place of violence, particularly directed at women. And what I'll do is I'll quickly run over the three types of violence that manosphere undertake, noting that they are all deeply linked. But then I'm going to go into them a bit more depth when I discuss the causes of the manosphere and the underlying causes of these violence. So we can really see three real types of violence that have emanated from the manosphere. The first is events of mass violence. So feminist and anti-women sentiments have been behind several mass shootings, massacres, and terrorist events. The most prominent of these attacks have been undertaken by self-described incels. So, for example, there was the Isla Vista shooting in 2014, kind of undertaken by Elliot Rogers, who killed 6 people before killing himself. That was in California. And a 2018 van attack by a man called Alec Manassian. He took a van and drove through a busy street in Toronto and killed 11 people. Both of those men left manifestos expressing their disconnect from and deep rage at the world, alongside their hatred of women. They expressed a feeling that violence is all that was left available to them. It was the only option that they have, and followed through with really terrible consequences. The second type of violence we often see from this community is online networked violence or online harassment campaigns. These are again primarily targeted at women. This started with the Gamergate campaign, which is a systemic campaign of abuse targeted at female games developers. And many people say that Gamergate is the origin of the Manosphere and origin of a lot of online harassment towards women. There was the fappening, which involved the illegal release and sharing of thousands of nude photos of female celebrities, and thought audit, which is one I'm going to go into in a second, in which men reported female sex workers in the US to the IRS for auditing. So to give you a bit of a broader understanding of these types of campaigns, I'll just go into the thought audit, which is one that I have studied in a bit more depth. So in 2018, the thought audit started when a man called David Wu posted a Facebook poll with the question, "Is sex work real work? How would you guys consider it?" The next day, a user replied stating, "I use these polls to find self-admitted sex workers and report them to the IRS." The term thought is derived from an acronym, that ho over there. And then Thought Audit quickly shifted from that Facebook poll to become an online campaign during which primarily men reported self-employed sex workers to tax authorities, particularly the IRS in the US, with the intent of having them audited. This was carried out in sites such as 4chan, Reddit, and in particular Twitter, and it sparked a brief wave of misogyny and harassment targeted at sex workers, particularly those who use platforms like Premium Snapchat to sell their services. Some participants built databases filled with names and accounts of thousands of sex workers to report. Those participating in the campaign assumed that these women were not already abiding by laws governing income tax, and sex work, which was an assumption that was based in sort of misogynistic understanding of these women as being irresponsible, selfish, and hypocritical. And we see a lot of that play out in discussions of sex work in these communities. So while it's not possible to determine exactly how many women were harassed on this campaign, in the context of a workforce that was already highly stigmatized and marginalized around the world, Thought Audit had severe impacts on its targets. It was another example of ongoing incidents of dehumanizing harassment targeted women sex workers both off and online. And many online sex workers recognize that the threat of being, while many online sex workers recognize that the threat of being reported to IRS was minimal, it really did cause hurt and distress, and potentially increase digital and physical violence directed at those doing sex work. So that's one example of this kind of networked harassment that occurs. And I will come back to the thought audit, which is why I raise it now. But these kinds of trends, or this dehumanization, the digital harassment, are very common throughout networked harassment undertaken by the Manosphere. And the final type of violence that is promoted by the Manosphere is sexual violence directed towards women, or everyday violence, quote unquote. Although, of course, the impact is never every day. But the type of violence that women already sadly experience in society through sexual violence that gets perpetuated and pushed further by the Manosphere. So pickup artists and the seduction community teach often extremely manipulative tactics to men in an attempt to attract and seduce women. The community is centered primarily around expensive courses taught by influencers who make a bucket load of money teaching men these manipulative tactics. They often involve workshops where men are taught these techniques, followed by real life experience where they go out onto the street to practice these skills in front of the watching eye of their teachers and fellow students. So just to give you a sense of the kind of violence that is taught amongst the Manosphere, there's a number of techniques that are very commonly taught, and there's a whole lot of history and material, so books, workshop material, all this stuff that develops these techniques. And the techniques are based in an idea of an inherent nature of women, that there is something inherent within women about how they respond to sexual and romantic advances. And that game is what they call game, which is how you pick up women, is really a set of rules that you need to follow. And if you follow these rules, you can sort of quote unquote unlock the secret of women and get as much sex as you like. And so it's very quantitative in the way that they explore these ideas, and therefore a lot of these ideas are very much based in the pseudoscience of how they understand women. So some of the techniques they teach, for example, there's the no means yes philosophy, which is probably the most common things taught in the community, is that basically men should not accept no for an answer when approaching a woman. It promotes the idea that a woman's refusal, her saying no, is merely a test or her playing quote unquote hard to get. To achieve success, therefore, it is integral for men to not give up. They must pursue a woman until she gives the answer she really wants, which is to say yes. And we can see the obvious risks associated with that of pressuring women or assuming that women, when they say no, are really meaning yes, which can lead to the thoughts, which can lead to sexual assault and rape. The Manosphere also teaches a number of manipulation tactics, particularly revolved, or one of the most commonly taught tactic is the idea of negging, which is giving women backhanded compliments to lower her self-esteem and in turn make it easier to manipulate. So some quick examples of negging are things like backhanded compliments, such as, I love how you'll just wear anything, or you're really smart for someone who didn't go to college. There's insults designed as concerned, such as, are you really going to eat all that? Making unfavorable comparisons, such as, my ex used to wear her hair like that. It looked better on her, though. Undermining accomplishments, such as, that's a nice little promotion. You must have worked hard for such a small role. And subtle put down, such as, I usually don't go for a girl like you, but you're okay. Negging is a technique that's promoted to undermine confidence, which is in turn used to create a power imbalance between a man and a woman. And obviously, this is again all pseudoscience, but this is what they teach. They teach that in making a woman insecure, the belief is that if it will make a woman seek solace in the man making the statements, and that again, in turn, it's a way to increase the ability for them to pick up women. Final technique they teach is one called last minute resistance. They believe and teach the idea that women are often put up resistance to having sex at the last minute, often even in bed, even after a man has made all of the right moves to get her there. So there's a belief that women will engage in a last minute resistance moment where they'll get to that point of about to have sex and then they'll sort of put up a false barrier. And they teach a number of techniques about how to quote unquote push past that. And some of those techniques can include things like just literally pushing past it, continuing the sex, continuing the actions, a whole range of other things like using false psychology by backing away yourself with a belief that if you then back away yourself, the woman will sort of give up this last minute resistance. Or doing things like getting naked preemptively, so she has no choice but to participate in the sex. Now, obviously, you can hear all of the sexual assault that can occur through such ideas as pushing past this last minute resistance, or what's called last minute resistance. All of these techniques present game, which is the technique that they teach, and sexual relations in general as a power struggle. Within pickup communities, sex is considered as a challenge or a game to be won, with women treated as objects and not as real people. And that has a long-term impact on how they view women and how they view sexual sex and sexual intercourse, and the willingness that they have to engage in rape or sexual assault. Because if you don't view a woman as a person, but rather as an object, then it is more acceptable to engage in sexual assault. So, for example, Rollo Tomassi, who's a known blogger in the community and who goes by the title The Rational Male, He argues that sex is, quote, about urgency, anxiety, and tension, not comfort, familiarity, or rapport, or proving how much better a boyfriend I'd make than the jerk she'd enthusiastically spread her legs for because they naturally created that urgency, unquote. And you can see what I consider quite the sad picture of what it means to have sex. That it's not about comfort, familiarity, or rapport. It's not about connection. It's just a kind of transaction that should be done. And the problem is that women sort of back out of this transaction. The problem, how they see it, is that women back out of this transaction and don't participate in it fairly. And so that men have to learn these rules about how to participate in this transaction. So those are the three types of violence that we often see playing out in the manosphere. So the mass violence, the networked harassment, and the sexual assault that gets promoted. I want to talk briefly about the role of the digital platforms in promoting this. And then I'm going to go and have a look at what's behind this. How can we understand the causes of this, and then how that influences the way which we respond to these communities. So digital technologies, social media platforms play a key role in facilitating all of this. In particular, so the manosphere exists primarily online, and so we have to understand it as an online phenomenon, and that it's deeply shaped by the structures of online platforms. I'm not going to go into this in too much depth because it can become quite technical, so I'm happy to answer some questions at the end about it. So to understand this, we need to understand the fundamentals of digital platforms, and digital platforms are driven primarily by advertising, and that is how they make their money. And then, therefore, what they want is as many eyeballs on their platforms as long as possible. The more people who are on the platform, the more advertising that can be sold. And that is what we call the attention economy, that they're driven by attention. And that's why we see platforms try and really push to have as many people on there at all times. And it's why we actually have quite large monopolies in some of these platforms. This means that highly emotional content is often promoted on these platforms as it brings attention. And so a lot of research has been conducted that things that are highly emotional are more likely to keep people on. So posts about facts or boring news stories are less likely to bring people consistently there. But if you can go online and get in fights with people, or see stuff that makes you upset or angry, you're more likely to keep coming back. And so social media platforms have an incentive to get people coming back into these places. So a couple of examples of that, there's been a lot of conversation, for example, about rage bait, which is content that's deliberately designed to make people angry. And that has been shown to bring people back to the platforms, to people to engage in the platforms, and in influencers and particular individuals. So a lot of individuals will use rage bait, content designed specifically to make you angry. They'll do it deliberately because they know that that's a way that they'll get engagement. We've also seen examples of algorithms, the use of algorithms which push people to more extreme content. The YouTube algorithm is the most obvious of this, where people will go online and get more and more extreme content. So often you'll have the pipeline of people starting on self-help videos and ending up in far-right extremist videos. And that's because YouTube keeps feeding new things that are likely to keep you engaged, and often the more extreme content is that. The other component of social media platforms that's really important is speed. Campaigns of harassment often occur at mass speed, meaning that damage can be done before anything can be stopped. I found this in the thought audit campaign that I described earlier, where the campaign was whipped up within a matter of 24 or 48 hours, meaning it was spreading globally before anybody had a chance to do anything about it. And things can spread really quickly and globally. And often misinformation or really hateful content can spread really quickly and globally. Finally, platforms have shown real resistance to regulation. And this is particularly been shown in the Trump era. So we had post the first Trump presidency in sort of 2020, there was a shift back to more regulation when Joe Biden was elected, including the banning of Trump himself. But now, particularly with Elon Musk taking over X, shifts in politics in the US, there has been a real resistance or a real opening up of these spaces, and a lot of these spaces have become significantly more hateful because the platforms do not want to engage in regulation. They've made the calculation that having hateful content on there is better for them financially than regulating it, both because it costs less to regulate, but also because those people are there and people are still engaging with it, and so they're willing to keep it on there. And so we're seeing a real proliferation on violence and violent material on these spaces. So for my final two sections, I hope to speak for another 15 to 20 minutes. I want to talk about briefly what's behind all of this. How can we explain the argument? The violence that exists here, and then what can we do about it? And I'll touch on that at the end. So I argue that the manosphere is a response to the multitudes of crises that have been created by late-term capitalism, and the crises specifically the way that they're impacting on men. Men, as with everybody, are facing a significantly changing and increasingly complex and uncertain world, both economically and socially, and changes that are happening at a very rapid pace. Specifically, the previous social systems that dominated the post-World War II era have been replaced by what Susan Faludi calls as an ornamental culture, one that, quote, encourages people to play almost no functional roles, only decorative or consumer ones. I won't go through this change in detail, but what's important to know is that in this culture, which is one we all live in, people are directed away from participating in social systems such as politics, church, unions, social groups, to instead focus almost entirely on individual selves. And the rise of influencers is a really key part of this. This has fundamentally changed how people relate to the world. So now, Susan Faludi, for example, says that manhood is defined by appearance, by youth and attractiveness, by money and aggression, by posture and swagger, and by props, by the curled lip and the petulant sulk and the flexed biceps, by the glamour of the cover boy, and by the market-bartered individuality that sets one astronaut or athlete or gangster above another. Of course, this just hasn't just impacted on men, with everybody losing out in these social changes and losing out because of the social structures that they used to participate in disappearing. This disconnect from society has also been backed by material reality. So we know that due to increasing costs, due to the cuts to social services, that social activity has dropped because people are working more and because social activities cost a lot more, but also because a lot of public spaces have closed down. You can now only really go out into public if you can spend money. People are also engaging a lot less in political processes due to a lack of time and distrust in mainstream political parties. And the manosphere is one way in which some men have sought to understand and navigate this changing world. I emphasize that it's only one way. There are lots of ways that people are understanding this world. The manosphere gives men a place to air grievances, a narrative to understand why the world is as it is, a community of like-minded people, and a sense of purpose in which they have, in what seems like an increasingly purposeless world. To delve into this a little bit more deeply, the manosphere is an example of what I describe as an intimate public and what other theorists describe as an interpublic. So an intimate public refers to groups who bond over a shared worldview and emotional knowledge. In short, it's a place where people can come together in public spaces to share and talk about intimate ideas, their own personal ideas, and they can connect to that. They connect through a collective feeling about their position in the world and believe that they can create change not through politics, but through sheer force of their community and the feeling behind it. One of the functions of an intimate public, particularly in the case of the manosphere, is the creation of an in-group and an out-group. So the in-group is obviously the people who are part of that public, the people who are connected via a shared identity. In this case, it's men. And an out-group is a group that is othered, and sometimes, in turn, violence is justified against them. So this othering is something that we talk about in this theory in these spaces a lot. And othering is a process of differentiation and demarcation by which a line is drawn between an us and them, between a more or less powerful and through which social distance may be established and maintained. Othering is really, really common in far-right and extremist places. We saw this, obviously, the most clear example is the othering of Jewish people by the Nazis in the Second World War through a lot of the imagery that was created, talking about Jewish people as being subhuman, propaganda in which they were spoken of as animals, and therefore, in turn, that creates a sense of them as being completely different, and in turn, that violence is justified against them. So othering is a really useful rhetorical tool as it allows people to coalesce around their in-group and in turn blame their out-group for their or the society's ills. So we see this really clearly in the Manosphere, with the in-group being men and the out-group being women. As I've already just noted, women are othered through being described as being inherently different to men. And the Manosphere uses evolutionary psychology to back this up. They, for example, complain that all women are hypergamous. That is, that they only want to enter relationships with men who are wealthy or good looking. And they use a lot of this kind of pseudoscience to back up their othering of women. They believe, hypergamy, for example, they believe is evolutionary driven, and it fosters this belief in such inherent differences. So to go back, for example, to the campaign that I discussed earlier, we can see these practices of othering through the network, through the thought audit. So as I noticed and discussed, the thought audit was really specifically targeted at sex workers. And in focusing specifically on sex workers or non-traditional women, men spoke of them as frivolous, emotional, and irresponsible. They spoke of them as destroying society because of their refusal to pay taxes and also their willingness to sell their body for sex, which they believe ruin what these men see as a traditional heterosexual monogamous ideal structure. There's actually a lot of hypocrisy associated with that, and I could go through that in more detail, where men often speak of their willingness to have non-monogamous relationships. They talk of themselves as chads, as men who are very sexually promiscuous, but then women who engage in this are considered as being not that, as being someone who is ruining society. There's a real hypocrisy there. So thoughts were framed as diametrically other to socially minded men. In the process, by validating the social position of men in the manosphere as those who are traditional and defending society, and then the thought as the one being destroying it. So I just want to quote here from a user on 4chan to explain this. So a user posted a number of lines that really outlines or really shows this othering process. So I'm just going to read out this, and apologies in advance for the not very nice language. So the poster says, "Imagine being a whore. Imagine how much it stings being told off by fucking virgins. Proof God has a wonderful sense of humor. After years of being shunned and degraded, incel, one way or another, I am fucking you. Hashtag thought audit." So what you can see here is the othering between the man and the woman. So he identifies him as a virgin who has God on his side by saying that God has a wonderful sense of humor. And the first line is an othering process of othering women by calling her immediately a whore. So through positioning themselves against the thought audit gave users a sense of collective identity. As another user on 4chan posted, "Now I become the thought order destroyer of whores," posting as if he was joining a band of brothers fighting a just cause. Users also connected with each other over the campaign, as another user posted hashtag thought audit, I fucking love you guys, which is a real common refrain in these communities of talking about the Manosphere as a collective, as a brotherhood, a place to bring people together. And that's often very, very important to the Manosphere. It's a place of bringing people together in a world in which that social connection, that opportunity for social connection has been lost, which I discussed before. And people seek these connections online because that's often the only place in which they can find them. Participants in this community campaign also argued that they were on the side of the majority of the population, at least online. Not only were they a community themselves, but they were one that represented the wishes of broader society. This makes it become easier for others to feel comfortable in joining in. In this sense, Manosphere rhetoric that positions themselves as typical folks in some ways works as a mobilizing mechanism for online harassment campaigns like this one. So another user, for example, said, and I quote, "Normies on Twitter think hashtag thought orders is fucking hilarious. There is a lot of support for it. People really don't like hookers," unquote. And you can see here the language of normies, which is normal people. thinking that this is hilarious. They don't like hookers. So this is an idea of bringing normal people into this campaign and sort of justifying it through saying that this is just a normal thing we do. So participants therefore spoke about the thought audit as a justified campaign against sex workers. It suggests that women, especially non-traditional women like sex workers, are irresponsible and that they and the leftists who defend them are hypocritical, demanding to be, that they're hypocritical, that they're demanding to be respected as workers, but not want to take on the responsibilities of real work, such as paying taxes. And in othering women, they set themselves up and their violence as being entirely justified. So overall, what you can see here and what's causing a lot of the rise in the manosphere is a couple of processes. First, a breakdown in social structures and a growing sense of insecurity. Secondly, a process in which men are seeking a connection and sort of meaning in these spaces, and often that meaning is really quite simplistic. And the manosphere provides that meaning through telling men that the problems with their society, with the problems with their lives, are driven by women and feminism. And then the third process is the othering of those groups, of women in particular, and that results in a justification of violence. So we can see inherent causes in the breakdown of in a bunch of social structures that are resulting in these flow-on effects, and that is leading to the rise of these communities. I want to emphasize again that this is not just the manosphere is one symptom of these breakdown of social structures. We can see a range of different symptoms, growing nihilistic sentiment, QAnon conspiracy theories, the rise of the far right are all connected to these broader social changes that are occurring. So to finish, I think we should just talk a bit about how this influences how we think about and engage with the community. So I want to start off by talking about what we probably shouldn't be doing when we respond to this community before going into some alternatives. So violence, misogyny has often been ignored by the police, security agencies, and social media companies, and I've talked about that already. And many are therefore arguing that the first step is for it to be taken seriously, for things like domestic violence to be considered terrorism. I think it's important that agencies intervene when things get serious, and I'm sure a lot of you do work closely in this area. But there are some significant risks. First and foremost, obviously, anti-terrorism laws have been rightly criticised as undermining civil rights, taking away people's rights to privacy and due process, and that it targets people of colour unjustly and has increased the scale of surveillance state. And I don't think we want to replicate that by expanding the reach of such legislation. What's possibly even more worrying is that anti-terror legislation has potential to push extremist groups further to the fringes of society. And there is a likelihood that such approaches will perpetuate a sense of injustice and exclusion, furthering the idea that these men are oppressed by a society that wants to violently smash not just their communities, but their very sense of self. So while I think, intervention is really important when things get super extreme, it can't be the full solution. So what do? We need to engage followers and tackle the misogyny. I want to start, what we need to do first is tackle some of the core issues that are causing the manosphere to rise. As I've already noted, men are attracted to the manosphere to draw a sense of alienation from themselves and society. And so we need to desperately address these perceptions of their masculinity, their social and economic alienation, and their sense of a lack of future. There are many, many different things here about what we can do. One of those, for example, is investing back in social structures, social places. I was reading some terrifying statistics recently from the United Kingdom about the closure of public spaces, including things like playgrounds, sports fields. We're seeing this here in my hometown in Canberra at the moment, where there's an ongoing discussion about the loss of public space, often being taken over by private development. We can't afford to lose these spaces, and we need to keep fighting for them, because that's the thing that continues to push people online and into these communities and into dangerous spaces online. So getting people out physically and engaging with people physically is a really important thing that we need to be doing. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done to address the root causes of these issues. But I also want to talk about how we talk to men, particularly those who are considering entering the manosphere now, because a lot of those social changes, those big structural changes, are going to take a long time. Because I do think that we have a potential to engage with many men who are interested in the manosphere if we provide them with an alternative. So one burgeoning area of research that provides some potential avenues is an area of research called alternative narratives, which has been growing in popularity amongst movements aiming at preventing and countering violent extremism. And I talk about this because it's really important when encountering men who are interested in the manosphere to be talking about it in a particular kind of way. So previously, there's been a lot of research around extremist groups, say, engaging in what's called counter narratives, and basically that is a process in which you counter what they say. So if a young man comes to you and says that women, the pay gap is fake, you counter them with statistics, and this has been used to counter a lot of extremist ideologies. The research around that is very sketchy, with little evidence suggesting that it works. So fighting men on the ideology is just unlikely to work. First, it's because ideology isn't often the first reason that people join these communities, and so in turn, it's not necessarily the reason they're going to stick around. People often join due to a sense of isolation or disconnect from society, with the manosphere providing a space where individuals can be heard. Our counter narratives therefore target the wrong part of the problem. Moreover, arguments with participants can often be received defensively, pushing people further into extremist ideas. So if we challenge men, this creates a sense of a binary between yourself and that person, in which you are now entering into an argument with them rather than engaging in some genuine conversation. And that can often push people further into those communities. This is particularly problematic, for example, and I get lots of questions about parents, when parents are the ones doing the challenging. Many kids or young people join this group due to a desire to rebel, and so to have parents come and challenge them simply reinforces this desire, making the manosphere even more appealing. So I think we can do better than this. In other movements designed to reduce radicalization, a new approach called alternative narratives is becoming increasingly popular. So this aims to reduce radicalization and extremism by giving participants an alternative to explore a story to help explain their situation and feelings, providing a different, more positive path for people to go down. So instead of trying to counter misogynistic ideas, alternative narrative seeks to talk with men about the real causes of their problems and encourage them to join movements to tackle these causes. Core to this is working through creating joint understandings of the world. It means there's recognizing the kernel of truth of men's complaints. And that means recognizing that complaints are genuinely felt, even if at times we don't agree with them. Alternative narratives then work to find and build alternative understandings of where these feelings come from, which social structures may be blamed for the problems, and the solutions available to them. This is all based on empathy and understanding. Instead of attacking people who are being inclined to manosphere ideas, we need to start by understanding where their concerns come from. So the core of that is what we should be looking at is developing skills so that people can work on providing alternatives for young men who are attracted to manosphere ideas. And I suspect this goes to all extreme ideas. In some cases, it may mean finding alternative social groups or helping them get sustainable work. In other cases, where such options are not available, it may be helping them find and enter social movements that are helping fight for the changes needed in our society, whether it's positive masculinity groups, campaigns for economic and social justice, or even joining feminist movements. We see a lot of this already in our community, particularly with men creating more men's groups, more positive masculinity groups. One of the things that I often talk about is the importance and the need that these groups have diversity amongst gender and racial lines, because we don't want to perpetuate the idea of men and women being inherently different and separate, because that just perpetuates the long-term harm. We should treat the complaints of young men as being based in real fears and seek ways to talk with them about how different factors, primarily our current economic and gender systems, are causing these problems. And we need to seek areas of common ground and build upon these areas to bring people into movements rather than pushing them away. Alternative narratives has been found to be really effective, particularly at those fence sitters, people who are not completely embedded in manosphere groups, but may sit on the edges or be tempted by their messages. So I'm not suggesting we go and debate Clavicular or Andrew Tate. That's never going to work. But we can do some work with the people who are following them. And I think they're the ones that many of you may come across. It's about finding different pathways for individuals to follow, providing a replacement for the manosphere, another space in which men can feel a sense of belonging and connection. I think this is a major shift for many people campaigning, particularly in the released public space, particularly for those who have reacted strongly and fought hard against the manosphere. And I know that many are scared and angry at leaders who make up the community. So I'm not expecting everyone to do this work, but it's work that I'm committed to doing. And I think for a lot of practitioners, it's a really relevant way of thinking about how to talk to people who come to them with these kinds of ideas. Not only do I think it can halt the rise of the manosphere, but can also bolster other ways of thinking and being, and desperately ways that can really help change men's lives in a way that the manosphere really doesn't.
Thank you for attending this webinar. Please feel free to share our resources and let us know if you have any feedback. If you would like to learn more about our program, visit projectparadigm.com.au and be sure to tune in to the next webinar.